In the early medieval period, specifically between the 9th and 11th centuries, across what would now be considered modern-day France, a law was enacted. A law so specific, so curiously narrow, that it applied only to left-handed blacksmiths who resided within 1 mile of a consecrated church. According to this obscure legal statute, if a left-handed blacksmith created a horseshoe that injured a nobleman's steed, within 3 days of a major feast day, the blacksmith would be fined not in coin, but in iron filings. These filings would then be melted down and used to reinforce the hinges of the church door. The rationale behind this was rooted in the belief that left-handed individuals were more susceptible to demonic influence, and thus their craft work could inadvertently harbor ill omens. The church believed that by taking the filings and melting them into the door, it would effectively seal out these unintended curses. This law remained on the books for over 137 years, though there is no record of it ever being enforced, nor of any left-handed blacksmith residing within the specified radius. In a neighboring region, within the Duchy of Saxony, a legal directive was introduced that prohibited peasants from whistling after sunset during the month of March. This law was not merely advisory. It was codified, inscribed, and recorded in no fewer than 3 separate municipal charters, each containing detailed descriptions of the whistle's tone, pitch, and duration. Whistles considered shrill were treated more harshly than those deemed melodic. The penalty for violating this statute was the surrendering of 1 full loaf of rye bread to the town's watchman, who would then ceremonially toss the loaf into the nearest river as an offering to appease the spirits of the drowned. This custom was rooted in an old belief that whistling could awaken the ghost of a miller's daughter who had died during a flood in the year 882. Local superstition held that her spirit, disturbed by high-pitched sounds, would roam the countryside, spoiling milk and tangling loom threads in retribution. The townspeople believed this law was crucial to their agricultural success. In the city of Bruges, during the mid-13th century, an ordinance known as the eel length statute was implemented to prevent competitive dishonesty at the city's popular eel-throwing festivals. This unusual sport involved hurling eels, live and extremely slippery, from rooftops to crowds below, where townsfolk attempted to catch them with buckets or baskets. To ensure fairness, a law was passed stating that no eel used in competition could measure less than 6 3/4 inches in length, or more than 8 1/8 inches. Any eel outside this range was deemed ineligible, and its handler fined a portion of his annual salt ration. Local scribes were employed to measure eels with great precision, using custom-cut ivory sticks marked with tiny runes. These sticks, preserved in wax-lined leather cases, were passed down as family heirlooms. A second clause of the statute also stated that any eel which escaped measurement due to excess slipperiness would be considered innocent and could not be used again in the same calendar year. If the bearer was too tired, the breath could be borrowed from a spouse, a sibling, a friend, but only if the exhaler had not yet eaten anything sour that day. Sour breath was thought to make the flame impatient, and an impatient flame was dangerous. 3 breaths, always 3, 1 to waken, 1 to soften, 1 to send forward. Villages kept lantern logs, yes, lantern logs, where each lighting was recorded with the initials of the breather and a note about the wind. Entries read like poetry. M.B. lit westward under still sky. J.R. sour-chested passed to E.H. No wind. Light hummed. These logs were not checked or judged. They were merely kept, like folded handkerchiefs or pressed leaves. Once lit, the lantern was not to be moved quickly. To swing a lantern too fast was to insult the darkness. Light was to arrive slowly, as a guest, not as a conqueror. And in the coastal monasteries of medieval Portugal, where sea mist rolled across tiled roofs and salted air breathed in every prayer, a final law governed the writing of lists. Not letters, not books, not scrolls, lists. This law, known to scribes as the order of the 5th line, required that every 5th line in a list, no matter its contents, be copied twice. The duplication served no accounting purpose. It was entirely symbolic. The 5th item was said to be unstable, prone to confusion, a crack in the structure of memory. By writing it twice, the scribe anchored the list, anchored the thought, anchored the day. In some cases, the 5th line would be written not only twice, but with a slightly duller quill to distinguish it. Duller ink meant stronger roots. This law extended even to shopping lists, lists of names, inventories of stones or spices. It did not matter. Scribes who failed to follow it were expected to recopy the list in its entirety before sundown, or else place it inside an empty jar and bury it until the new moon. The belief was that an unanchored 5th line could drift, migrating into dreams or prayers, and twist its meaning. Students were taught list order in silence, under oil lamps that burned whale fat and thyme. The classroom walls bore tapestries of 5-fingered leaves and pentagons woven in soft wool, reminders of the balance that could be found in a number made whole only by repetition. And so it was. Law after law, custom after custom, soft rhythms of time drawn out in dust and parchment, in soot and soup, in bread and bird call. Nothing quick, nothing sharp, nothing loud, only balance, only ritual, only the slow, droning heartbeat of a world held together by quiet agreements and very, very patient people. May your door shadow fall cleanly. May your spoon face downward. May your breath warm your lantern. And may your fifth line always be written twice. Households kept their own drying stones, often named and passed down as heirlooms. Names like Lowen, Sheepler, or Cairn's Cradle. Children greeted these stones each morning, sometimes draping them with ribbons or brushing them gently with feather bundles to honor their service. If a cloak was too wet to hang, it was folded into a spiral and placed in the hearth smoke, not near fire, never near fire, but in the smoke, to be remembered by warmth. Visitors who ignored this custom were lent the oldest family cloak and instructed not to walk too fast. Rushed footsteps, when paired with a cloak that hadn't properly breathed, were said to draw the rain back. There was even a phrase for it, softly spoken. He walks with wet memory. In the icy northern edges of what is now Estonia, a peculiar and repetitive code governed how snow was to be stepped upon. Known as the First Crunch Law, this winter statute insisted that no one, regardless of age or rank, could make the first footprint on fresh snow without pausing to nod at the nearest tree. This nod was not just a polite gesture, but a silent agreement between ground and body. The tree, as witness, was to acknowledge the disruption. Snow, after all, was seen as a woven silence, a blanket of time not yet touched. To step into it was to speak before listening. And that, according to the law, was disrespectful. Each tree had its own way of being acknowledged. Birch trees required a bow. Pines expected a hand over the heart. Willows were difficult. You had to whisper something you remembered from childhood. Just one word, even a sound, would do. If someone forgot to nod before stepping, they were expected to backtrack, walking backward along their own footprint trail, and recite a brief apology in 3 parts. One step taken, none were asked. Let frost forgive. Let hush unmask. I walk again, with quiet fast. This verse was not optional. Elders remembered who recited it. Children practiced it in school with sticks pressed into flour to mimic snow. In rare cases where the snow was disturbed without a nod, and no apology was given. The individual was instructed to carry a pine cone in their pocket until the snow melted. Natural penance for speaking out of turn in nature's silence. Farther south, in the olive grove borderlands of medieval Catalonia, a particularly slow and ceremonial law controlled how olives were to be introduced to salt. This law, officially titled the brine pause ritual, demanded that every batch of olives, before being salted, be poured gently into a ceramic basin, where they must rest in complete silence for 1 full hour. No music, no speech, no stirring. The basin was to remain uncovered, its rim dusted lightly with rosemary ash. This was called the waiting bowl. The belief behind the ritual was simple. Olives, like memories, needed to breathe before being preserved. Brining them too soon trapped their bitterness inside. Salting them after rest allowed that bitterness to rise out like steam, like a forgotten story finally spoken. Olive briners, called salmadores, were trained to listen to the olives, not literally, but patiently. They'd watch the fruit, listen to the air, and feel the moment when the basin was ready to receive. Should a brining be rushed, the batch would be discarded, not as punishment, but out of respect. The law required the briner to place the wasted olives at the base of the oldest tree in the grove, along with 3 drops of their own spit, symbolizing taste, remorse, and renewal. The tree would forgive, and next season's fruit would be watched more carefully. Each basin had its own blessing engraved at the bottom. Phrases such as "salt knows time," "bitter out, wisdom in," and "crack not the quiet" were common. Young apprentices would recite these blessings slowly, running their fingertips around the basin's rim, clockwise, 12 full times, before salting began. In the quiet valleys of medieval Moravia, a law was passed, so slow, so subtle, so profoundly uneventful, that even its enforcement was described in whispers. It was called the Lantern Breath Charter. This law mandated that any lantern lit between dusk and full dark must be exhaled upon by its bearer 3 times before being hung or carried. The exhalations had to be slow, unforced, natural. No speaking in between, no sniffing, just breath. The act was believed to warm the flame with intent, to give the light a portion of the soul before it wandered into the open air. Without this ritual, the lantern's glow was thought to flicker unpredictably, attracting the attention of things best left unlit. Some families marked their mirrors with tiny charms, little bells, feathers, or smooth stones tied with thin red thread to remind others of the required order, Traveling guests were often offered a bowl of water, a perch for birdsong, and a crust of bread, even before being greeted. This way, they could meet their own reflection with clarity, even in a stranger's home. Far inland, deep within the pine-coated hills of medieval Bavaria, a very old statute dealt with how smoke was allowed to leave the home. This law, known as the Spiral Smoke Code, dictated that chimneys must be angled in such a way that smoke could rise, curve slightly westward, and disperse in a spiral rather than in a straight line. The law's reasoning, recorded in the faded ink of community scrolls, was simple but firm. Straight smoke goes too fast. It forgets the fire. Spiral smoke remembers. It was believed that fire, if its smoke rose too quickly, would feel abandoned. This could lead to cold hearths, wet wood, or cracked pots. To prevent this, chimneys were built with a slant, often with a special wooden flap inside, a twister beam that encouraged the spiral shape. In villages where homes were too small to permit chimney slants, the law permitted the burning of pine cones with curved spines, which were thought to bend the smoke spiritually, even if not physically. On certain winter mornings, entire neighborhoods would stand outside, staring up at each chimney's breath, checking the angle, watching the spirals. Those with the best spiral were praised with murmured blessings. Those whose smoke went straight up were gently advised to relight the fire and offer it something sweet, a sprig of dried plum, or a single drop of honey on the logs. The truly devout left notes beside their fires. These notes contained small poems or thanks. Common phrases included, "You warmed my waking," "May your ash be light," or "Smoke slow, burn true." These were not prayers exactly, but they were not prayers either. Back across the continent, in the grassy steppes of medieval Hungary, a seasonal law regulated the use of bells during fog. Known as the Muffled Ring Edict, it stated that during heavy fog, defined officially as the inability to see one's hand beyond 3 outstretched fingers, no bell may ring at its full tone. Every bell, from chapel to cowbell, had to be muffled with linen or wet moss to ensure a softened chime. The reason was both practical and poetic. It was thought that fog dulled the ears of angels, and that sharp sounds rang crooked in their hearing. If a bell rang too clearly, the message it carried might be misheard. A summons to supper might sound like a summons to sorrow. A call to mass might seem like a call to mourning. Therefore, all messages through fog had to be gentle, rapt. blurred slightly by cloth or water. To help enforce the law, villages created ringing cloaks, squares of wool or velvet, with tiny pockets for stones. These cloaks were tied over bells, not just to soften the ring, but to give it weight, to slow it. Each bell had its own cloak. Some were passed down for generations, with lace stitched by great-grandmothers who had never seen the fogless sky. When fog passed and clarity returned, the cloaks were not removed immediately. The law required a wait, 2 bells' time. The first bell was to signal that fog had lifted. The second bell, rung with full tone, was the release. Only then could the linen be folded and stored. Only then could the messages be heard as they were meant. High in the damp green reaches of medieval Ireland, especially along the stone paths that bordered the hills of Munster, a law known as the Rain Cloak Timing Statute dictated not only when cloaks could be worn, but how long they had to be aired out after use. Cloaks worn in the rain were considered spiritually absorbent, not merely wet. It was believed they gathered not just moisture, but fragments of sky mood, overcast thoughts, wind-borne worry, clouded memory. And so, by law, a rain-drenched cloak must be hung not on any line, not on any tree, but on a smooth, round stone before sunset. The law was clear. The stone must be round, not oval, not flat, round. And it must rest upon soil, not pavement, always the soil. The cloak could not be worn again until it had dried fully and laid over a different round stone for a second airing, this one at sunrise. This was known as the second breath. Skipping the second breath was believed to curse the next journey with muddy boots, tangled thoughts, or meeting someone whose name you'd forget the moment they spoke it. To prevent repeated incidents, monks were instructed to wet their nostrils with warm herbal water before sweeping. A bowl of dried moss was kept near most broom closets for emergency breath stilling. If a monk sneezed more than twice in the same week while sweeping, he was gently assigned the quiet watch, a meditative post that involved observing the dust motes in sunlight and describing their paths in the margins of the monastery's daily record. These entries were not meant to be read. They were meant to be written, then forgotten. Writing down the movement of dust was said to calm the mind, to return balance, to complete the breath that had been broken. In the quiet meadows of medieval Transylvania, a unique agricultural law applied to the gathering of mushrooms. This law, referred to by scribes as the Cap Shadow Edict, was concerned not with what mushrooms were picked, but how they were approached. The law dictated that no mushroom was to be picked until the picker had sat beside it, in silence, long enough for its shadow to fully cross the fingers of their right hand. This meant waiting. Waiting through clouds, through wind, through the still. Pickers often carried small wooden blocks to steady their hands as they crouched. Some wrapped their fingers in cloth to better feel the moment when the mushroom's shadow touched them. It was believed that each mushroom was watching, that the timing of its picking determined whether it would nourish or unsettle. A mushroom picked too quickly might cause confusion. A mushroom picked too late might cause sorrow. Only the perfectly timed shadow touch produced the balanced harvest. Children were taught mushroom manners before learning to write. They practiced by drawing tiny mushrooms in the dirt and pretending to wait for their shadows. A child who grew impatient was asked to carry a pebble under their tongue until the next meal, a gentle reminder to pause, to hold back, to wait for what is right. Not soon, not fast, but right. Those who disobeyed the cap-shadow edict were not publicly shamed. Instead, they were visited at dawn by the village elder, who would place a single, uncooked mushroom upon their doorstep, resting on a page torn from an old herbal. No words, no knock, just the symbol. In the low-lying marshlands of medieval Frisia, where mist lingered well into midday, and the air was thick with reeds and silence, a curious law governed the timing of mirror use. Called the reflection delay mandate, this law stated that no person, man, woman, or child, was to look into a mirror before having touched water, heard a bird call, and eaten a bite of bread. The order was strict. Water first, bird second, bread third. Only then was the self considered settled enough to behold its own image. Mirrors were not common, of course. Most were polished copper or sheets of burnished silver. But even these reflective tools were treated with reverence and caution. The belief behind the law was this: that the face, if seen too early in the day, would wake without anchoring, and that this would cause a person's thoughts to drift too far ahead of their actions. Such disconnection, though invisible, was said to cause strange speech patterns, misplaced objects, or an inability to finish sentences without trailing off into silence. The law was meant to tether the soul to the body via water, bird, and bread before it met its own eyes. If someone was caught peeking into a mirror too soon, they were not scolded, but simply given a small piece of charcoal and asked to draw 3 circles on the nearest wall. These were called soul hooks. It was thought they would recapture whatever had gotten ahead. Some homes kept these circles year-round, layering them gently beneath fresh paint each season, as a quiet offering to the balance of awareness. In the high villages of what is now Slovakia, a seasonal ordinance emerged known as the mute string rule. This law applied only to the first month of snowfall. It required that all cords, ropes, strings, and threads hung outdoors, be it for laundry, grain, herbs, or bells, must be tied with a double knot known as the silent loop. This loop, formed with a precise crossing motion, was believed to mute the tension of the cord, allowing the string to rest through winter. Untied or poorly knotted strings were believed to sing too much in the wind, emitting whispers that called to snow spirits, urging heavier snowfall and deeper drifts. To maintain quiet, families used wool-wrapped ropes that muffled their own vibrations. Metal hooks were banned during the mute month. If a string hummed, whined, or whistled audibly, the law required that the household untie it immediately and coil it into a figure-8 pattern before resting it beside a warm fire. This act was known as cord recovery and was typically accompanied by the recitation of short, repeated phrases like, "Rest now, twist, be still and whole. The wind is not your burden." If a cord hummed at night, the family was to leave a mug of milk beneath the window as an offering, not to drink, just to witness the wind. This was never questioned. It was simply done. And so it continued, and continues, the slow tick of laws, customs, and rites drawn out into the stretch of sleep itself. In the orchard-ringed villages of medieval Lombardy, a centuries-old statute addressed the act of biting into fruit for the first time in a new season. Known quietly as the First Bite Protocol, the law applied to apples, pears, plums, and figs. And it stated, without ambiguity, that the first bite taken from the first fruit of the harvest must be done in absolute stillness. Not simply silence, but stillness. The body was not to sway. The feet were not to shuffle. The hands were to be clean and without rings. The fruit was to be held at chin height, turned slowly 3 times clockwise, then once counterclockwise before the teeth made contact. The bite had to be firm, but not hurried, sincere, but not eager. The juice must be allowed to remain in the mouth for 3 full seconds before swallowing. This was not an act of superstition, but of balance. The villagers believed that the tree observed the first bite, and if the bite was too casual, if it was rushed, sloppily chewed, or followed by speech, the tree would withdraw its sweetness for the rest of the season. Trees were said to withhold, to flatten their flavors. This belief was so prevalent that designated first tasters were appointed in some communities, individuals with steady hands and patient hearts who could be trusted to begin the season properly. These tasters trained their breath to slow, their jaws to remain symmetrical, their chewing to follow the beat of their pulse. Should someone bite incorrectly, the law required that the remainder of the fruit be buried beneath the tree it came from, with a single coin resting beside it, a symbolic repayment. The offender was then expected to eat no more fruit for 3 days, and must instead consume only bread dipped in rainwater. Children were taught the first bite method using wooden apples and blindfolds. The ritual was repeated in late summer festivals, and entire villages once gathered in silence to watch a single child bite into a fig, as cicadas hummed quietly in the background, and a white cloth was held beneath the tree to catch any fallen drops. It was not about taste. It was about reverence. Not far from there, nestled in the monasteries of Corinthia, a monastic code addressed an even more peculiar behavior: sneezing during the act of sweeping. The dust breath rule, as it came to be called, stated that if a monk sneezed while sweeping an interior stone floor, he was to immediately set the broom down, turn to face the nearest unlit candle, and recite the dust psalm. O grain too light, too soon adrift, return thy flight, accept thy gift. This short stanza, spoken softly and slowly, was meant to settle any disturbed spirits of stillness that might have been roused by the involuntary sneeze. For it was said that dust, when stirred by accident, carried thoughts, carried memory, and when cast suddenly into the air, these thoughts could scatter, mix, and confuse the mood of a sacred space. A sneeze was seen not as a failing, but as an opening, a breach in the quiet flow of order. Far to the west, in the misty meadows of medieval Wales, a repetitive legal custom known as the egg cradle mandate governed how fresh eggs were stored in homes during equinox season. The law stated that for exactly 7 days before and 7 days after each equinox, both spring and autumn, eggs could not be stored in baskets, bowls, or cloths. Instead, they had to be laid gently into individual beds of straw arranged in circles, known locally as egg cradles. Each cradle could hold only one egg, and each egg was to be turned slightly at sunrise and again at moonrise. The practice was believed to calm the spirits of the hens, who were said to observe from unseen places, keeping track of how their offspring were treated. The law further required that when turning an egg, one must use the backs of their fingers, never the tips. The motion had to be smooth, careful, silent. If a cradle was disturbed, or if two eggs touched, a small poem was spoken to reset the balance. Feather made you, straw shall hold, turn with care, in silence old. Children were taught the practice before they could even count. A rite of passage in many villages involved the child turning an egg perfectly for the first time, supervised by a grandmother or hen keeper. Those who turned too fast were asked to sit and watch the sunrise without blinking. Those who dropped an egg were not scolded, but were given a cracked shell to wear on a string around their neck for the day, to teach the fragility of form. At the end of the 2-week cradle period, the eggs were gathered slowly into a white cloth and taken in silence to the communal fire pit, where they were either boiled, blessed, or buried depending on the shape of the yolk. Round yolks meant warmth. Slippery yolks meant rain. Broken yolks foretold visitors. The entire process, while exhausting, brought peace to the villages. No one questioned the law. It gave purpose to pause. In the quiet corners of medieval Flanders, where brick ovens glowed warmly from morning until dusk, there existed a law so mundane, so meticulously observed, that even the bakers recited it in their sleep. It was called the crust division rule, and it stated that no loaf of bread baked before noon could be sliced from the middle. Ever. Only the ends, never the center. The middle, it was believed, had not yet learned its place in the loaf. Cutting it too early, too eagerly, was considered a type of arrogance. The ends, rough and hardened, were the only portions permitted for immediate tasting. The law required that the middle be given its hours, a phrase meaning that a bread's center had to rest, cool, and consider its purpose. This resting period lasted until the church bell had rung 3 times after midday. It didn't matter if the loaf was still warm. It didn't matter if guests were waiting. The middle was off limits. To enforce this rule, loaves were often marked with a cross scored lightly with a dull knife. The cross was a reminder. Not yet. Not now. Patience brings flavor. Some families went as far as painting a single red dot on the loaf's top crust, removing it only when it was safe to slice the center. One village developed a practice called bread guarding, where a loaf was placed under a bell jar with a strip of fabric wrapped around it. The color of the fabric changed every hour. Blue for waiting, green for ready, black if someone broke the law and sliced early. To guard against accidental line drawing, each village employed a dirt witness, a rotating role given to widows or retired scribes who would walk the edge of footpaths each morning with a stick, not for drawing, but for smoothing. Their job was to erase wandering lines left by animals, children, or wind, restoring the calm balance of the surface. These women were often called the sweepers of Earth's thought, and many had personal sandbags tied to their waists for weighting paths and testing soil compliance. If a line was discovered to be too long, the villager responsible, whether intentional or not, was expected to sit beside the line for a full hour, facing west, and contemplate its potential meanings. They were required to speak no more than 5 words during this hour, and each word must be spaced with a breath at least 5 seconds long. This practice was believed to unfold the line spiritually and reduce its hold on the world below. In the fog-drenched valleys of medieval Austria, particularly those near the borderlands of Tyrol, an old ordinance regulated the behavior of spinning wheels on Sundays. This was known among local villagers as the Quiet Spindle Law. The law decreed that on the 7th day of the week, any spinning wheel left unattended must be positioned in such a way that the spindle pointed toward the door, not the wall, not the fire, not the loom, but always toward the door. This positioning was thought to encourage the safe return of travelers, particularly those away on trade or pilgrimage. The spindle, pointing outward, became a beacon, a directional whisper for wandering feet. It was said to guide the wind homeward, carrying messages of safe passage. If a spinning wheel was found facing inward on a Sunday, even unintentionally, the household was believed to invite forgetfulness into its walls. Elders warned that food would be overcooked, socks would be mismatched, and goats would stray if the spindle pointed wrong. To correct this misalignment, a family had to spend 3 minutes walking slowly around the spinning wheel, hands clasped behind their backs, chanting a soft rhyme. Wheel of thread, guide the tread, point the way, bring them home instead. The rhyme was repeated as slowly as possible. The slower the pace, the deeper the apology. Some families turned this into an afternoon ritual, walking around the wheel while preparing herbs for drying or shelling peas. The law made no exception for absent-mindedness. It was never about blame. It was about balance, direction, intention. Over time, regional craftsmen began carving tiny arrows onto the base of each wheel, not for decoration, but as a reminder. Some wheels bore inscriptions like "Face the door" or "Thread calls the path." One famous weaver in 1352 went so far as to train her cat to sit beside the wheel every Sunday morning to watch the door. She believed the cat, who had once walked with a monk, could sense spiritual misdirection and would meow if the spindle strayed from its lawful bearing. This silence was sacred and meticulously timed. Wool gatherers often carried hourglasses tied with string to their belts, calibrated to the still wind rule, which required 2 minutes of silence before the first tuft could be touched. If one broke the silence during this period, even by coughing or stepping too heavily on dry leaves, the hourglass was reset, and the gathering postponed until the following morning. In especially sensitive regions, known as dream wool zones, the law extended to listeners nearby, children, spouses, even passing travelers, who were expected to place their hands over their mouths and sit in a meditative crouch until the wool had been lifted and placed in the silent sack. Local councils kept written records of these collections, known as the fluff books, where time, weather, mood, and sound level were described in repetitive detail. Common phrases included "no crows," "light wind," "no coughs heard," and "3 tufts gathered, 1 twig snapped, gathering paused." Villages often competed in annual silent wool festivals, where the most disciplined gatherer was honored with a pine wood comb and a moment of public silence from the entire community, held in their honor. In medieval Wallachia, deep within the shadowy glens and mossy ravines, a sacred law governed the act of well covering at dusk. Called the watermouth closure rite, this law required that every open well be covered with a slab of wood or stone precisely 9 minutes after the first visible star appeared in the night sky. Not 8 minutes, not 10, but 9. Always 9. The first star was determined by a designated sky watcher, often an elderly member of the village with clear eyesight and an understanding of stellar arrival order. Upon the sighting, the bell was rung exactly 3 times. Villagers then had 9 minutes to cover their wells and seal them with a phrase spoken aloud to the water. Close your lips, hold your breath, dream deep. This ritual was believed to prevent moonlight from touching the still surface of the well too long. If left exposed, it was said that moonlight would trickle down into the groundwater and make the next day's drinking water too dreamy, causing drinkers to become sleepy at midday or forget simple instructions. Those who forgot to cover their well were not punished with fines, but were required to carry a wet stone in their pocket for the next 24 hours. This stone, soaked in moon water, was to be rubbed between the palms every time one spoke to another person, to cleanse the dream residue. Well coverings were handmade, with each slab carved with a personal design, often a spiral, a droplet, or a closed eye motif. The process of making a new cover was ceremonial. Families would gather, chant the covering song, and place their hands one by one on the wood, sealing it with silence. If the slab ever cracked, it had to be buried upside down at the foot of a silver birch tree and replaced by dawn. In the western forests of what is now the Czech Republic, a strange and little-known regulation controlled the drawing of lines in dirt. This was known as the line law of 2 hills, and it stated that no line drawn in the earth, whether with stick, boot, or cane, could exceed the length of a cartwheel, unless it was drawn with the intent to divide bread or settle a boundary. Arbitrary lines were feared. Lines drawn without purpose were said to summon confusion into the soil itself, disorienting roots and leading to unpredictable vegetable shapes. Carrots with curls, potatoes shaped like fists, turnips that grew inside out. In a fog-heavy region of medieval France near the Bay of Biscay, a particularly slow-paced and oddly poetic law dealt with chimney sweeping. Known among scribes as the Whispered Sweep Act, this rule commanded that every chimney be swept only during moments of absolute quiet in the village. Quiet was defined not by the absence of noise, but by the presence of even silence, a silence not broken by footsteps, carts, or even birdsong. Sweepers would listen for hours, sometimes days, for this silence. When it arrived, they would work quickly, sweeping upward first, then downward, then once again upward, always ending on an upward motion. The belief was that soot falling downward could carry dark dreams with it. Ending the sweep upward, it was believed, sent the soot back to the sky, where dreams could be cleansed by starlight. Failure to sweep in this pattern required a special atonement. The chimney sweep would kneel at the base of the fireplace, place both hands on the hearth, and count to 49 in complete stillness. This was known as holding the black breath. If they spoke, sneezed, or scratched their nose during the count, they would have to begin again. In some homes, the law extended to listeners too. A misbehaving chimney might cause neighbors to suggest a double sweep, an intensive ritual that included bells, lavender, and a mirror placed on the roof. This was rare, but deeply respected. Chimney sweeps became part mystic, part craftsman, and would sometimes receive whispered thanks through the flue itself. In the olive-producing regions of medieval Castile, a highly repetitive and time-consuming law applied only during harvest season. This law, referred to in local records as the oil blessing regulation, stated that any olive oil poured for the first time from a new press must be watched drip, drop by drop, into the jar. Each drop was to be counted aloud, and upon reaching the 71st drop, the person counting would pause, place their right hand on the jar, and say, "Let no leaf remember harm." The counting would then resume. If the person miscounted or forgot the line, the entire process had to begin again with a new jar. This tradition was not merely obsessive. It was believed that improperly blessed oil would turn bitter and cause arguments at mealtimes. Each family developed its own oil counting songs to help children remember the law. These were simple, repetitive, rhyming chants with words like golden drip, silent sip, peaceful pour, and leaf no more. In later centuries, these chants were compiled into volumes by monastery librarians who believed the oil chants held secondary meanings, proverbs hidden in repetition. The slow pour of oil became a community ritual. Entire households would sit in silence, watching the stream, counting together. Some families made decorative drop beads, strings of glass used to count each drop without speaking. The beads were passed down, often wrapped in olive-stained cloth. Even the jars themselves were subject to law. They must be clay, never metal. They must be uncracked, yet imperfect. No two jars should match. This symbolized the individuality of peace, of calm, of patience in waiting for oil. The final drop of the first jar was never used. It was poured on stone outside the door, as an offering to the past season, and as a wordless prayer for the next. In the inland territories of medieval Denmark, nestled between the fjords and the frost-laden hills, there existed a legal mandate known in the old texts as the Wool Gathering Silence Code. This peculiar law required all individuals collecting wool from hedgerows, meadows, or sheep pens to remain completely silent for the duration of the gathering process. Not a word, not a hum, not a whisper was permitted while wool was being removed, whether plucked from thorn bushes or shorn from the animal directly. The law dictated that wool, in its loose form, was sensitive to sound, and that loud or rushed speech could wake the threads, causing them to snarl during weaving, or cause nightmares to those who wore the eventual cloth. In the remote forests of medieval Latvia, there existed a seasonal law referred to as the Moss Declaration. This decree stated that each autumn a household must declare one stone on their property as the keeper of moss. This stone, chosen through quiet observation, had to be spoken to at dusk with the phrase, "You will wear green. You will hold still." The moss was then monitored for the duration of the cold season, and any unnatural growth, sudden curling, unseasonal drying, was interpreted as a warning. If the moss detached fully from the stone, the household was expected to remain silent during meal times for 3 days to restore balance. At the end of winter, the moss was gently scraped, dried, and placed inside a small pouch, which was kept with family heirlooms. Some families recorded the mood of each moss season in moss diaries, passed down through generations. In the vast and wind-swept stretches of medieval Sweden, especially within the hamlets near Uppsala, a law once governed the act of bread slicing in the home, known formally as the Flat Edge Ordinance. This law specified that any bread baked on a Tuesday, and only on a Tuesday, must be sliced using the left edge of a blade, never the right, not the center, and certainly not the tip. The reason? Villagers believed that bread baked on a Tuesday absorbed the mood of the baker. If that mood was slightly impatient, or if the dough rose unevenly, it was thought the bread might develop a rebellious spirit inside it. Cutting it improperly, such as with the wrong edge of a knife, could release that energy in unexpected ways, leading to restless dreams, unfocused prayer, or poorly behaved livestock. Housewives were trained to observe the direction of steam from a freshly cut slice. If it spiraled clockwise, the slice was pure. If it spiraled left, a second blessing was required. That blessing involved tapping the loaf 3 times with the flat side of the knife, then whispering a short phrase: "Stay with peace. Crumble with grace." This law remained unchanged for 112 years. During that time, baker guilds developed tools specifically marked to help families remember which edge to use. These knives were crafted with tiny raised dots on the lawful side. Every spring, bread inspectors, yes, bread inspectors, would walk from village to village, ensuring compliance. Their presence was welcomed, as it was believed that households slicing bread lawfully would receive longer-lasting loaves that didn't harden overnight. Households caught using the wrong edge were not fined, but they were asked to write a detailed account of the slicing, including the size of the loaf, the mood of the morning, and any birds seen outside the window at the time. These scrolls were bundled and burned every solstice, with ash scattered in wheat fields to prevent bitter crops. In a remote pocket of medieval Croatia, shepherds and goat keepers followed a centuries-old decree known only as the hollow foot ritual. The law stated that on the 3rd Thursday of any month, with 5 Thursdays, herders must gently dip the right rear hoof of their eldest goat into a bucket of barley, water. The hoof was to remain immersed for exactly 11 seconds. No more, no less. After removal, the goat was to be turned counterclockwise 3 times, slowly, while the herder recited a traditional verse about patience. It was believed that this process prevented the goat from forgetting its paths during the upcoming grazing weeks. The goat was thought to carry a map in its hooves, and soaking that hoof helped refresh the memory of meadows, streams, and cliffs. If a herder failed to perform the ritual, he was to sleep beside the goat for 1 night, without speaking, in a pen filled with dry leaves and parsley stems. This ritual was widely accepted, and any herder who refused was called mapless in whispers at market. The ritual grew so popular that an entire branch of regional law was dedicated to hoof timing. Specialized hourglasses were carved from fish bone and used only for hoof soaking. Some families passed theirs down through 8 generations. These hourglasses were never used for cooking, never for praying, only for goat hooves. A single misplaced second was said to make the goat dream restlessly, leading to uneven milk. To correct such milk, a second law required the milk be strained while singing. The strainer's cloth had to be soaked in violet water beforehand and dried beside the elder tree. These were the layers of care, the detail, the precision that defined the law of the hoof. In a small Hungarian village known as Reykjavar, a civic law required all members of the shoemakers' guild to sleep with their shoes under their bed facing east. This rule, written into the guild's founding scroll, explained that leather rested best when oriented toward the sunrise. Improper storage of shoes, especially those turned west, was believed to cause uneven wear, slippery soles, or dreams of falling. Every quarter moon, a guild inspector would visit each household to check shoe orientation. If a shoe was found facing south or west, the shoemaker would be asked to write a letter of apology to the animal from which the leather came. These letters, stored in a small box at the guild hall, were burned annually in a cleansing ceremony conducted in total silence. One famous letter from the year 1333 begins, "Dear cow, my slumber disrespected your hide. I regret the angle. I will mend it." On the misty outskirts of medieval York, a local edict referred to as the Kettle Placement Ordinance was in place for nearly a century. This law stated that during the preparation of tea or broth on Fridays, kettles must be positioned slightly to the left of the hearth's central flame, never to the right. The reasoning was largely superstitious, tied to the belief that leftward heat stirred introspection and humility, while rightward boiling caused pride and restlessness. If someone was found boiling their kettle on the right side, they were gently advised to spend 1 hour in quiet contemplation holding a dried clove between their teeth. The flavor of the clove was thought to absorb the excess pride caused by rightward steam. In some cases, particularly stubborn violators were asked to prepare tea for the entire village while standing only on their left foot. In the Principality of Galicia, a heavily forested region, an official leaf-listening law was enacted for scribes and clerks. This law required that before drafting any legal document, the scribe must spend at least 5 minutes listening to the sound of leaves rustling. If no wind was present, a servant or apprentice would fan the trees gently with a wide goose feather fan to simulate the appropriate rustle. This ritual was believed to cleanse the ears and prepare the scribe's hand for balanced writing. Words penned without this auditory cleanse were thought to mislead readers or provoke misinterpretation. Some guilds trained their members in leaf sound memorization, with competitions held annually to test which scribe could identify tree species by rustle alone. The most honored scribes even developed personal rustling oaths, whispered before writing, so their ink would flow evenly and without moral bias. In Western Brittany, a rule known as the unseen butter mandate governed the storage of churned butter during Lent. The law required that any butter produced in the final week of February be stored in ceramic jars covered with white linen and buried beneath rose bushes until Easter. This practice, though agricultural in appearance, was spiritual in origin. It was thought that butter, a product of excess, needed to undergo a period of penance underground, hidden from human eyes and untouched by craving hands. Each jar was marked with a twig in the shape of a cross, and the location was recorded in a butter journal. On Easter morning, the buried butter was unearthed and shared in silence among family members while facing east. If a rose bush bloomed early, before Easter, it was considered a sign that the butter had been forgiven and could be eaten with wild honey. In the town of Tehillt, Belgium, an obscure hygiene regulation once required that all combs used on holy days be made from wood harvested under moonlight. Known as the Lunar Comb Law, this requirement ensured that hair tended on Sundays or feast days would remain spiritually aligned with lunar cycles. Combs, made from daytime harvested wood, were believed to provoke restlessness or vivid dreams. Local artisans crafted these special combs in hidden groves during the full moon, carving soft curves and etching symbols of calm. Each comb came with a wax seal stamped with the lunar phase during which it was made. If one used a daytime comb on a holy day, they were instructed to sleep that night with rosemary beneath their pillow and a handkerchief over their hair. Children were taught to recognize lunar combs by scent, touch, and the faint traces of night dew sometimes preserved in the wood's grain. Elsewhere, in the vineyards of Aquitaine, a long-forgotten wine law required that all wine barrels be serenaded with lullabies the night before their corking. Known as the wine sleep rites, this custom originated from a widespread belief that fermenting wine, if startled, would turn sour in protest. The lullabies were specific to the grape variety. Merlot barrels were sung in a low, humming tone. White grapes received softer tunes in higher registers. Each barrel's lullaby lasted approximately 2 minutes and was repeated thrice. Winemakers passed these songs down through generations, and barrel rooms echoed with drowsy choruses late into the evening. If a winemaker lost their voice, a child from the village was invited to sing in their place, often in exchange for bread or grapes. Wine, blessed with lullabies, was believed to cause more vivid dreams and sweeter sleep. In a damp, Flemish town near the coast, a peculiar decree required all shoe soles to be scraped against stone 3 times before entering the town hall. Known as the Stone Sole Law, this rule was said to drive out the mischief of wandering grit, which could travel into sacred administrative spaces on footwear. Grit, believed to contain fragments of forgotten intentions, was seen as a source of bureaucratic confusion. Those who forgot to scrape were not immediately punished, but their names were added to a soft-spoken list called the Register of Rushing. Each week, the registrar would read the list aloud to an empty chamber, believing the words would find their way into the ears of the inattentive. Over time, a small statue of a foot with polished stone toes was erected outside the hall, and many whispered their regrets to it as they entered. In southern Bohemia, during the festival month of Lammas, an agricultural law required farmers to address their scythes before and after each harvest session. The scythe was referred to by name, often passed down generationally. Names like Olga, Silverblade, or Hush. Each morning, the farmer was to thank the scythe for its service and promise a smooth sharpening before nightfall. At sunset, the blade was wiped clean and given a final whisper, a quiet hope, a personal secret, or a short phrase such as, "You've done well." A local guild once compiled the most common scythe whispers, with entries ranging from "cut cleanly" to "don't bite the stone." Scythes found abandoned or mistreated were taken to the guild and placed in a silent room called the House of Resting Edges, where they were polished and sung to until ready to be returned. In the far reaches of medieval Switzerland, particularly within the canton of Uri, a law was passed concerning the ringing of cowbells during fog, known locally as the Muffle Decree. This statute required that if visibility dropped below 3 goat lengths, all cowbells must be wrapped in linen to reduce their volume by at least half. The law was rooted in an ancient belief that loud clanging sounds during foggy weather disoriented guardian spirits that hovered above alpine meadows. Farmers were required to carry small strips of cloth, called spirit wraps, at all times during mist season. Each wrap had to be dipped in spring water, blessed during the last full moon, and tied with a knot known as a fog braid. If a cow's bell rang loudly during dense fog, the farmer was expected to kneel beside the animal, apologize to the air, and leave a thimble of milk on a flat stone before sundown. This practice, though tedious, was believed to ensure clear skies within the next lunar cycle. In medieval Estonia, a small island community enforced the Rooster Gratitude Code. This law stated that every family keeping roosters must thank each rooster personally at dusk on the first and last days of every month. The gratitude could be expressed through gentle words, a brief song, or the offering of one peeled pea. It was believed that roosters were not merely animals, but protectors of time, beings whose crows held back chaos. If a rooster went unthanked, it was said to become confused, and its next crow might disrupt the village's sense of time, leading to lost hours or sleepwalking. Roosters that stopped crowing entirely were considered to have withdrawn in disappointment and were to be honored with a silent crow vigil, in which the family sat in quiet reflection for 9 minutes, watching the rooster from a respectful distance. Along the southern banks of the Danube, a regional tax code imposed an unusual audit known as the duck egg inventory. Every family was required to submit an oral report, recited to the village clerk, listing the precise number of duck eggs they had seen, touched, or dreamed about in the previous month. Each report had to begin with the phrase, "By feather and shell, I speak true." Families that failed to report at least one dreamt egg were considered spiritually disconnected and were subject to minor taxation in the form of herbs, usually marjoram or mint. This law lasted for nearly 80 years and is believed to have originated from a single vision experienced by a local mystic who claimed to have seen the future of agriculture inside a glowing duck egg. In the Duchy of Burgundy, a cold season etiquette law governed how individuals were to greet one another on frosty mornings. Known as the breath law, it required citizens to speak no greeting until after exhaling visibly into the air. The breath was considered proof that one's soul was still present and active in the body, despite the chill. If no visible breath was observed, a second attempt was required. If still no breath was seen, the person was instructed to hum a tune while holding their palm near their mouth. Should the hand remain cold, the person was assumed to be spiritually paused and was to carry a sprig of rosemary for the rest of the day to ward off winter stagnation. Rosemary was distributed weekly in small bundles by church-appointed warmth clerics, who also carried spare mittens and measured hand heat using hollowed walnut shells filled with ash. In the colder reaches of medieval Poland, nestled among pine-laden hills, existed the lantern timing code. This particular law required all citizens of Krakow to light their street lanterns precisely 8.5 minutes after the town bell rang at sundown. Lighting them earlier was considered boastful, implying one was more prepared than one's neighbors, while lighting them later was seen as careless, suggesting negligence of spiritual and civic responsibility. Each lantern was to be lit with a flame carried from the communal fire in the central square. This ensured unity of light and was believed to protect the town from nocturnal spirits known as the Zimni, whose whispers were said to dim poorly timed lanterns. Citizens who failed to comply were not punished directly, but were instead issued a glow notice, a parchment displaying an empty lantern icon, which was pinned to their door for 3 nights. This served as a reminder and a quiet encouragement toward punctuality of flame. In rural Bavaria, around the early 1400s, the beard alignment statute was introduced. This regulation stated that all men whose facial hair extended beyond their chin must align their beards eastward during morning prayers and westward during evening meals. This alignment was performed using small wooden combs inscribed with compass directions. The law was spiritual in nature and deeply symbolic. Beards were seen as antennas to divine thought, and misaligned beards were thought to invite confusion, misinterpretation of omens, or memory loss. Families kept beard logs, detailed daily records of direction, weather, and combing technique. When a bearded man died, his logbook was often buried with him or burned in an incense ritual. Any man who resisted alignment for more than 3 days had to sing the Prayer of the Crooked Whisker aloud in public, a slow chant describing the trials of an ancient bearded monk who once forgot which direction the sun rose. On the Isle of Skye in medieval Scotland, a quaint law was observed concerning the use of ladders. The Sky Step Protocol specified that ladders with more than 9 rungs could only be climbed on even-numbered days of the week, and only if the climber had eaten porridge that morning. The reasoning, while obscure, was taken seriously by townsfolk. It was believed that odd-numbered days created unstable ether currents, and climbing during such currents could jostle unseen spirits residing between rungs 4 and 6. Porridge, considered a grounding meal, was thought to protect the climber from spiritual missteps. Citizens who climbed on the wrong day were required to descend slowly, in silence, and then knock on the nearest tree 3 times to apologize to the wood spirits for the disruption. In time, climbing etiquette grew elaborate, with some families crafting charm-embroidered socks to wear only when ascending. Meanwhile, in the Lombard territories of northern Italy, one law took a particularly granular interest in how spoons were used in public. The Spoon Courtesy Act of 1317 required all soup-eating citizens within the city limits of Pavia to stir their bowls in a clockwise motion no more than 6 times before the first bite. Stirring more than 6 times was considered an act of vanity and culinary disrespect. Local stewards often patrolled taverns and inns, counting the rotations made by unaware patrons. Those caught exceeding the legal stir count were required to leave a written apology under their soup bowl, detailing why they felt the need to stir so excessively. These apology notes, known as ladling slips, were archived by local judges and periodically read aloud during public hearings to deter future infractions. In the rain-drenched forests of Brittany, a curiously specific forestry law mandated that any tree struck by lightning must be addressed by name. Villagers were expected to give each prominent tree within a 5-mile radius a personal name, recorded in a public tree ledger kept in the local chapel. Whenever a bolt of lightning felled a tree, the eldest villager available would be summoned to whisper farewell to the tree using its assigned name. If the name was forgotten or mispronounced, the community would gather at dawn to perform a 6-minute silence facing the eastern sky. Failure to honor the lightning-struck tree properly was believed to invite further strikes in the village. The law remained unchallenged for over 150 years and led to tree naming festivals that lasted days, with names ranging from Old Grello to Miss Nimbleshade. Back in England, under the rule of Edward II, a small but influential village near Canterbury adopted what became known as the Pebble Seat Rule. This statute stated that any person caught sitting on a pebble larger than a chicken's egg while within church grounds must immediately stand, recite a short psalm, and place the pebble upon their head for 5 paces as an act of spiritual rebalancing. The church elders believed that pebbles of a certain size acted as vessels for idle thoughts, and sitting on one could trap such thoughts beneath a person's body, leading to dreams of sin or indecision. The law specified the size of the pebble with remarkable clarity, including multiple drawings etched in stone tablets showing comparative diagrams of pebbles, eggs, and onions. Travelers unfamiliar with the rule often found themselves corrected gently but firmly by robed monks who carried measuring twine and wore sandals made of pressed moss. In the Holy Roman Empire, a deeply unusual directive was issued concerning the playing of flutes. The Flute Intermission Decree stated that no individual could play a wooden flute for more than 4 minutes without taking a 30-second break to recite a line of poetry about bread. The reason for this, according to surviving manuscripts, was that continuous flute music might irritate the local air spirits, particularly those sensitive to reedy sounds. The poetry about bread served as a pacifier for these spirits. If a flutist forgot to recite the line, the performance had to be halted and resumed only after a loaf of rye was kissed and held aloft. There is no historical record of a spirit punishing a flutist, but enforcement of the law was considered sacred, and even court musicians observed it with discipline. Over time, a collection of over 300 short bread poems emerged, including popular lines such as, "Lo, ye crust, who braves the flame, rise once more to feed the same." In Lithuania, a late medieval agrarian community practiced what they called the wheel respect law. According to this law, Anytime a wheel, whether of a cart, barrel, or spindle, broke in public view, all onlookers were required to pause for a moment of silence and bow slightly in its direction. This act was symbolic, meant to honor the circle of effort and the toil of human hands. Wheels were considered sacred instruments of community progress, and their sudden collapse was viewed not only as mechanical failure, but as a metaphor for life's fragility. During market days, when wheels were more prone to breakage, bowing ceremonies occurred up to 12 times a day. Those who refused to bow were recorded in the Book of Friction, a local registry used only for this purpose. The registry contained not names, but descriptive nicknames such as "He Who Looked Away" and "The Upright Stranger." In coastal Ireland, specifically in the wind-swept towns of Connaught, the Seagull Silence Mandate was enacted during the 1300s. This law instructed all townsfolk to remain absolutely silent when seagulls landed upon the village rooflines during the week before the feast of Saint Baulan. Speaking aloud during this time was thought to disrupt a spiritual audit being conducted by airborne angels disguised as gulls. Villagers believed these angelic inspectors evaluated the moral cleanliness of chimney smoke, and any noise would distort their judgment. Those who violated the silence were compelled to collect and sort pebbles by shape, round, oval, or irregular, for a period of 3 days. These pebbles would then be laid in spiral patterns around the churchyard as penance. Records suggest that in the year 1334, a traveling bard accidentally sang during this period and was required to arrange over 900 pebbles, an act which took him 6 days and led to the creation of what is now known as the Spiral of Lament. Further west, on the Isle of Man, a regulation once governed the wearing of striped garments. Known as the Stripe Ordinance, this law dictated that no one could wear more than 3 horizontal stripes upon any single garment unless they had personally woven the fabric themselves under the full moon. Vertical stripes were exempt, but only if they were rissa or green. The underlying belief was that horizontal stripes created confusion for spirits of the air, who mistook them for barriers. To remedy any such confusion, those who wore illegal stripes were required to hang a wind chime above their door for 3 nights and recite an apology to the wind at dawn. Failure to do so could allegedly result in reversed dreams or unpredictable hair growth, both of which were taken as omens of poor seasonal harvests. In the border villages between Hungary and Transylvania, a centuries-old tax regulation dealt with invisible cheese. According to this obscure code, families who claimed to have no cheese during the midsummer census were required to host a cheese confirmation meal, wherein each member of the household would consume an invisible wedge of imaginary cheese. This ceremony, attended by the local tax official, was a symbolic affirmation that no cheese was being hidden from inspectors. The family would mime the cutting, smelling, and eating of the cheese in solemn silence, and end the ritual with a toast made from empty wooden mugs. Those who failed to perform the mimed feast were suspected of dairy deception and were penalized with an additional cheese shadow tax, calculated using the theoretical weight of what their invisible cheese should have been. In the icy highlands of Norway, particularly within the settlements near Bergen, a regional bylaw from the late 1200s required all unmarried men over the age of 25 to wear a hat fashioned from wool dyed with elderberry juice every Thursday. This law, known locally as the berry cap rule, was introduced to prevent what was known at the time as social chill, a term used to describe the stagnation of courtship among younger generations. The hat was not merely symbolic. Its color and texture were believed to emit a subtle warmth that encouraged conversation. Men who failed to wear the cap on Thursday were expected to spend that evening staring into a well while humming a folk tune believed to realign romantic energies. If the man could not hum in tune, the law required him to wear 2 hats the following week, one stacked atop the other, to increase his visual humility and romantic availability. In northern Italy, during the late 12th century, a peculiar city law known as the Basil Counting Statute required citizens of Verona to count their basil leaves aloud while harvesting them, specifically during the 3rd week of April. The count was to be performed slowly, rhythmically, in a tone that resembled a lullaby. Each citizen was expected to record their count on parchment, signed by a witness, and submit it to the Herbal Guild for verification. The reasoning behind this odd law stemmed from a folk belief that silently picking basil would provoke envy in house spirits, who might retaliate by hiding socks or misaligning ceiling beams. Furthermore, the law dictated that if a count exceeded 101 leaves, the picker must then gift the basil bundle to a neighbor, ideally one with fewer goats, as a sign of humility and anti-greed. In parts of medieval Wales, a law addressed the issue of misleading shadows. Specifically, during the month of January, it was considered illegal to cast a shadow on another person's shadow between the hours of 3 and 5 in the afternoon. It was believed that doing so might confuse one's soul double, a mythical twin said to exist in the twilight between worlds. Villagers who violated this shadow law were instructed to apologize formally by writing a short poem to their own reflection in the nearest body of water. This ritual was to be performed barefoot, with 1 foot in the water and 1 on dry land, while holding a candle that had never been lit. the apology had to be recited thrice. If the poem did not rhyme or included the word spoon, it was deemed invalid. In Austria's Alpine hamlets, there was once a law that forbade anyone from opening a window wider than the width of a goat's horn during the winter solstice. This rule was inscribed into local charters in painstaking Latin script and passed down orally in folk ballads. The justification was rooted in ancient weather superstitions. Wide windows were said to invite the cold spirits who might enter a house and twist the dreams of sleeping children, making them grow crooked like frost-bitten saplings. Should a window be opened too wide, the homeowner was required to place 7 twigs of yew beneath their pillow for 7 nights and refrain from speaking the word ice during that period. Offenders who ignored this purification rite were believed to suffer from a phenomenon called mirror fog, wherein their reflection would lag behind by a heartbeat for the rest of winter. Far to the east, in the Carpathian borderlands, there existed the turnip whisper law. This regulation, which remained in effect for over 2 centuries, required that turnips be spoken to before being harvested. Farmers were mandated to address each turnip individually, using gentle words of farewell and gratitude. The ritual speech needed to last at least 5 seconds per turnip and include mention of the earth, the rain, and the moon. Turnips pulled without speech were considered cursed and were not to be eaten, but instead thrown into sacred compost pits known as root beds. Local monks often monitored the fields during harvest to ensure compliance. Entire families would sometimes sing in slow, harmonious tones as they gathered the vegetables, creating a droning chant that echoed across the meadows for hours. Further south, in the Pyrenees, a community law among shepherding clans prohibited the use of the word cheese within 48 hours of the summer solstice. Instead, locals were required to refer to cheese by a series of euphemisms such as the pressed moon, cow's blessing, or woolly curd. Violators of this linguistic law would be required to kneel in the village square and chant an apology in goat language, a symbolic ritual where one bleated rhythmically for exactly 47 seconds. The origin of this custom is believed to date back to a mistaken belief that uttering the word cheese so near to the solstice would cause all local dairy to spoil under the sun's zenith. A superstition reinforced by an unfortunate year when a fungal infection ruined 3 years' worth of stored rounds. During the reign of Henry III in England, it was required by local statute that all monks passing through certain abbeys must hop on 1 foot while traversing the cloister, if the abbey was built on land that had once been a pagan site. The law was justified as a gesture of spiritual lightness, symbolizing the lifting of the soul above the sins of ancestral grounds. Monks who failed to comply were subject to a penance that involved copying out the Book of Job in full, using only duck quills soaked in vinegar. A time-consuming and frustrating task that often left their fingers stained purple. The records indicate that one monk, Brother Aldwyn of Lancaster, violated the hopping rule thrice in 1 year, and thus was forced to copy the text no fewer than 9 times, leading to severe arthritis and eventual reassignment to kitchen duty. Among the more mundane yet bizarre regulations was the barrel law of Württemberg. It stated that no barrel could be filled with mead unless a town bell had been rung precisely 7 times, at intervals of 1.5 minutes, beginning at midday on the second Tuesday after the harvest moon. This was to ensure spiritual cleansing of the barrel through acoustic vibration. The local priests believed that the resonance of bell chimes would purify the liquid and prevent outbreaks of melancholy or possession among the drinkers. Mead made outside of this acoustic window was labeled tainted and could only be consumed by bachelors over the age of 50. If consumed by the young or married, it was said to cause impure dreams or make one speak in riddles. Local poets often sought out this tainted mead for inspiration. Meanwhile, in 14th century Bohemia, a law required that all public proclamations be sung instead of spoken during the month of October, as a tribute to Saint Borislav, patron saint of choristers and town criers. The rule extended even to legal accusations. If someone wished to accuse a neighbor of theft, they had to do so through a ballad. Failure to sing the charge resulted in dismissal of the case. This led to a golden age of folk accusation songs, many of which were passed down as traditional tunes. Some of the lyrics were highly poetic, while others simply rhymed poorly and featured repetitive choruses like, "He took my pig, oh yes he did, behind the barn where no one hid." In Denmark's rural provinces, a peculiar law stated that every new bride must plant exactly 7 cabbages within 3 days of her wedding, each cabbage named after a virtue: patience, honesty, humility, thrift, mercy, diligence, and silence. If any of the cabbages failed to sprout within 2 weeks, the bride was required to sleep outside in the barn for 1 night, as a symbolic penance. Villagers believed the cabbages served as moral omens, and that wilted cabbage reflected poorly on a bride's spiritual readiness. A second offense required her to boil and eat the failed cabbage, regardless of rot, while reciting a 30-verse prayer detailing the sins of pride. In the year 1271, within the marshlands of eastern Holland, a regional ordinance known as the Duck Path Decree was enforced upon all farmers whose land bordered a waterway. The decree stated that if a duck was found crossing one's property more than twice within a 7-day period, the landowner must construct a miniature wooden bridge, no less than 1 cubit wide and 4 handspans in length to facilitate further crossings. This was believed to be a gesture of goodwill toward the spirits of wandering souls, who were thought to ride upon the backs of ducks during mist-heavy dawns. If no bridge was built, and the same duck was observed circling the area again, the landowner was obligated to spend an entire afternoon sitting quietly by the river, whispering apologies into the reeds. Failure to comply resulted in a symbolic fine, a single feather plucked from a household pillow, to be carried by the village constable in a small satchel until the next equinox.